Okay, let me record. Okay, now the recording is started. So this webinar will be recorded, and the video will be shared on Data2X YouTube channel in a few days. Also, if you want to ask questions during the presentations, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen on the menu bar, or if the menu bar is on the top of your screen, then use that Q&A, and then we'll select a few of your questions to pose back to the speakers during the Q&A session. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Niraja to moderate this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and welcome to all of you who are joining us today. My name is Niraja Penamecha, and I'm the Senior Manager with Data2X. We work as a technical and advocacy platform focused on improving the availability, quality, and use of gender data worldwide, with the ultimate goal of making a practical difference in the lives of women and girls. And we do this through partnerships. We have a really interesting topic in very limited time, so let's just jump straight to the discussion. One of the many unfortunate effects of the COVID-19 pandemic has been to reinforce existing gender inequalities, including in how men and women engage in different types of work. Women's employment is often riskier because they work in sectors with losses, like service jobs, or because their employment is informal. For example, in Africa, 74% of women's employment is informal, and so it's not protected by unemployment insurance, and it's not eligible for government support. And at the same time, at home, women are also taking on more unpaid care work, such as increased childcare due to school closures, or looking after household members who have fallen ill. And so while we have a sense of this, and there have been some really great efforts to collect data quickly, we still don't have the information and data we need to fully understand and address these gendered inequalities of work. So today's presentation and discussion will focus on that by looking at recent efforts from the International Labor Organization to better define and measure work, and how we can implement those new approaches at a national level to really help fill those critical gender data gaps. Joining us today, we have three speakers. Miriam Kitembe is a senior statistician from the Tanzania National Bureau of Statistics and a member of the Africa Gender Data Network. She'll set the scene with an overview of a labor force survey that is currently ongoing in Tanzania. Then Karen Walsh, who's a senior statistician with the ILO, will take us through the latest standards for work statistics, what gaps these can help fill, and some thoughts on how to apply them. And then finally, we'll turn to Emile Kone, who is the Director of Studies at the Employment Agency in Cote d'Ivoire. The new standards for work were piloted in, among other places in Cote d'Ivoire, so we'll hear from him about the experience and challenges of applying these updated standards. And so with that introduction, I'd like to turn the floor over to Miriam to share with us about the ongoing labor force survey in Tanzania. Miriam, I think you're on mute.
I'm going to present on implementation of 2020 Integrated Labor Force Survey in Tanzania, which is, we are in data collection stage and it is ongoing. We are in the second quarter of data collection. The structure of my presentation, I present the introduction, background of labor force survey, objective of 2020 integrated labor force surveys, coverage and sampling techniques, questionnaire design, and the expected output of the survey. In the introduction, the integrated labor force survey is a household-based survey conducted in Tanzania in every 5 years. And the survey provides key labor market indicators addressing economic growth and the reduction of income poverty in the country. The survey results are used in a variety of the ways, and the major ones are being the microeconomic monitoring and the human resource development planning, formulating and monitoring employment policies and programs, measurement of relationship between employment, income, and other characteristics, and formulating income generating and maintenance schemes and vocational training. The background of the integrated labor force surveys in Tanzania. The first labor force was conducted in 1965, which is 4 years after independence, and the second one was conducted in 1990, 91, and the third one was in 2000, and the fourth one was in 2006, and the fifth one is 2014, and the sixth one is the one we are conducted in the 2020. You can see the interval is different because sometimes there is lack of funds to maintain the 5 years in interval of conducting integrated labor force surveys. The objective of 2020 integrated labor force surveys is to obtain the comprehensive data on the status of labor market prevailing in Tanzania. The specific objective of data geared to provide key labor market indicators on the following areas. We'll have the indicators of employed population, unemployed population, not economically active population, unemployment and underemployment, labor force participation, current and usual economic activities, size of employment in the informal sector, and cash income from non-agriculture employment in all types. Coverage and sampling technique. The 2020 Integrated Labor Force Surveys is a household sample surveys and will provide labor statistics at national level, rural and urban areas. The survey cannot provide the regional level statistics because the sample size, in order to have the regional level statistics, we must have the large sample size to cover the region level. And the 2020 integrated labor force sample was drawn from national multi-sample established from 2012 population and housing census. It consists both urban and rural enumeration areas from all 31 regions of Tanzania, mainland, and Zanzibar. So the total of 755 enumeration areas has been selected, of which 48 enumeration areas are from Tanzania mainland, and the 175 enumeration areas is for Zanzibar. And this, in each enumeration areas, 24 households in each enumeration areas are interviewed. The survey is implemented over the specific time frame of 12 months on quarterly basis, of 3 months interval to take care of seasonality in Tanzania. So we are in the second quarter of data collection. We have completed the first quarter, and in December we will complete the second quarter of data collection. And in each quarter we are doing the 60 household in each enumeration areas. Types of questionnaire that we are using. We have 4 types of questionnaire. We are using the household questionnaire, where we have the household information, and then individual questionnaire. The individuals are selected from the household register. So have individual questionnaires for the individuals of age 5 years and above, and this is for economic activities for household members in 2 periods. That is last week and the 12 months before the survey. This is for general labor force. And the working children survey questionnaire, this is for the children of age 5 to 17 years, and it is for child labor informations. And the time use questionnaire, this is gender related indicators, and this is used for collection of information on time use on different activities. And 1 person is selected from the household. So not all persons are interviewed for the time use questionnaire. So we are expecting to have our analysis will be done into 3 main domains. The first one is the 3 main domains: Dar es Salaam, other urban areas, and the rural areas. Dar es Salaam is always separate because it is in Dar es Salaam the whole area of the Dar es Salaam are considered as urban areas. So we have three domains: Dar es Salaam, other urban areas, and the rural areas. What are we expecting? We're expecting on the following gender and the labor market indicators. We'll have the labor force participation rates, we'll have employment to population ratios, we'll have the status of employment, we'll have employment by sector, hours of work, employment in the informal economy, unemployment rates, and youth employment. And all indicators will be sex disaggregated in order to get the gender related indicators. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I think that was just a very clear reminder of how significant and complex an undertaking it is to administer a survey on a national scale, but at the same time, how incredibly necessary and valuable that type of survey is to answer some really fundamental questions about economic growth and poverty reduction. With that, I'd like to invite Karen to talk to us about the 19th ICLS standards and how they can be used to help us understand more about how women and men work differently. Karen?
Okay, thank you very much, Niraja. So perhaps you can first tell me when you can see my screen.
Looks good, thank you.
It looks good. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to all for organizing this and giving me the opportunity to talk today. Here you can see it's the 1st of December. There's a 5 missing there, obviously. It's 15th of December today. And I want to talk about some of the things we've learned during 2020 about measuring women's and men's working lives, what type of data we need, what the role of international standards is, and so on. So, I mean, there's a first message, which I'm not going to go into in depth today, but I do want to mention, which is that just keeping data going this year has been an incredible challenge. I'll speak very briefly about that at the end, but it's not the main focus of my talk. But it is something we have developed a lot of guidance on and do attempt to support countries with. But today, I'm more interested in the range of data that we have learned that we need to understand the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and related lockdowns on people's working lives, which includes, but is not limited to, needing data on paid employment, including details on issues such as absences and working time. So this information would typically come from a labour force survey anyway, but it's become increasingly important to have it. But we have also found, as mentioned by Niraja in her introduction, that data on unpaid work has assumed increased relevance and importance, and data on demand for paid employment. And the reason I mentioned these 3 headings is these are the areas that most countries, when publishing now, are focusing on, and for which the latest international standards are particularly relevant. And that's what I mostly want to focus on now. So I'm going to start by giving a very brief background on international statistical standards and work. There are a variety of international statistical standards covering topics relevant to a labour force survey, or relevant to the measurement of work, I should say. They come from a conference that takes place once every 5 years, hosted by the ILO. It's called the International Conference of Labour Statisticians. And for those of you familiar with labour statistics more generally, you will probably know that the standards that most countries have been using for measuring employment and unemployment in particular came from the 13th ICLS, which took place in 1982. So it's quite a long time ago by now, 38 years. And that's been the main basis of labour statistics in recent decades in countries in all regions of the world. Okay, but there has been an important update to that at the 19th ICLS in 2013. And we've also had a more recent International Conference of Labour Statisticians, which focused on the issue of work relationships. And this is also very important. It touches in particular on status and employment, which, as Miriam mentioned, is one of the key variables you would collect disaggregate employment statistics. So I just want to illustrate this difference, and this is something we and Data2X have recently published information on. So the 13th ICLS, which is still quite widely applied across the world, effectively just identified 3 status. So the entire population was broken down into 3 key status. And these were, and using data from a series of pilot studies we did between 2015 and 2017, I've showed the type of information this gives when disaggregated by sex. Well, it shows us the total number employed, and this was defined with respect to the system of national accounts. Okay, so this was all people who contributed to production of goods and services within the system of national accounts production boundary were defined as employed. Now that is very important because it's a very economic concept. It sees people as a provider of labor for economic production, which is excellent if your entire interest is economic analysis, but somewhat sufficient if you have a more social focus of your analysis, like differences between groups in the population, such as men and women. And it meant that employment as defined then include different types of unpaid work, such as subsistence farming, because it was a form of economic production. Therefore, everyone doing that activity was considered employed. Now, the 13th ICLS also defined unemployment, which were people who were not employed, who were looking and available for work, but there were some alterations for national context. And the third, residual, effectively, were a group called not economically active. This framework has proved useful, but is limited and does have some problems. So, for example, unpaid work was often not visible in reality, and we had limited coverage of people who had an unmet need for employment. Basically, we saw those who were unemployed, who met all the criteria that we defined, but everyone else who might have some demand for work, we had no definition. We had nothing being published for these in many countries. And in 2020, what I would say is, if we're applying these standards, we could see our statistics reacting very slowly in cases, for example, where what was happening to people was they were moving from being engaged in paid employment, paid work, to perhaps going back to subsistence farming, because within the definition that was still employment. So you had no change in status. So these standards, while very useful historically, had some key issues, among which was an important gender bias, if we can put it that way, because many unpaid activities were considered within the definition of employment, making gender gaps look smaller than you would argue they should be shown. But moving on, I want to show what the 19th ICLS gives us by contrast. Well, the employment definition has now been narrowed. It's specific to work for pay or profit. What this practically means is that it generally leads to a reduction in the level of recorded employment, but that depends on the context of the country. So countries with high levels of subsistence farming will see a potentially substantial reduction in the estimated level of employment. But we now have a greater visibility of people with an unmet need for employment, because even though unemployment is still a very important indicator, it's not the only indicator that we promote to show people who need, who are saying that they need or want employment. We have groups that are called time-related underemployment and the potential labor force. Now, if you look at what's on the right of the screen, this is a visual representation of what that gives you, right? Now, I'm not going to go through all these numbers in detail, but what I want to highlight about this is you can just see visually, compared to this picture, just how much richer this picture is. Okay. Now, sometimes people see richer and see more complicated, which I understand, but it also means it gives a far better perspective on what people are doing, what their reaction or their engagement with the labor market is. And just to highlight here, it's very, very gender relevant, because if I look at the percentage of people who are in unemployment, this yellow segment, it looks like there is relatively little gap between men and women. in this case, using this data. But if I look at this group called the potential labor force, there's quite a substantial difference, and females are relatively higher. So what we promote is that the application of these standards gives much richer data to see how people might transition within the labor market or around the labor market. In addition, we have information on participation in unpaid work when the standards are applied. So the standards acknowledge that people can be engaged in multiple working activities, a mix of paid and unpaid working activities in the same period in time. And the evidence shows undoubtedly that females in employment are more likely to also engage in unpaid work, and almost all are still engaged in unpaid household service work, even when they're employed. And that's what this picture on the right shows. If I just highlight this part in the top right, these are females in employment. 96.7% of them from this sample were also engaged in unpaid household service work, cleaning, cooking, taking care of children, etc. Now you look among males, it's still true of a large percentage of employed males, but it's a substantially lower percentage than females. And this is something that becomes visible when we apply the standards through something like a labor force survey. Another thing is that we get indicators on participation in unpaid work and a new perspective on working time. So the summary message I'm going to give here is that under the old standards, we just focused on this comparison. Males in employment work 40 hours per week. Females in employment work 35 hours per week using this data. However, when you add unpaid household service work and own use production of goods, we get a completely different perspective. Okay, women, at least in the samples we had used for this study, but I would expect to see this generally repeated, work substantially more hours than men in own use provision of services, meaning that when you add them all together, you end up with a higher working burden being showed by this data for women, even if men are performing more of the paid work. And this is a slightly different perspective on that, but I think also useful, is to show that if we just look at employment, males in this sample again, perform 62.4% of all the paid employment work based on working time. Whereas if you look at own use provision of services, which are these unpaid household services, women are performing 3/4 of all of that work. Okay, and if we apply the standards, we open all of these doors to see these impacts potentially. So these have been the subject of various reports that have been recently published. There's a blog, which I'm showing here on the left-hand side. We have 2 reports, one relatively shorter and one quite in-depth, using data we have collected from pilot studies. And I'd also like to highlight that our good friends and partners, Data2X, have published a very interesting and useful brief on a similar topic, how the 19th ICLS really expand our understanding of women and men's work and engagement with the labor market. So how do we go about applying the standards? Well, very simply and practically, it requires an update to the labor force survey or other surveys measuring labor. It is very clearly relevant to COVID-19 impact evaluation. We do need to go beyond employment and unemployment to understand what's happening in the time of COVID, because people are being impacted in so many ways. Sometimes people are being forced to reduce their working hours. So we need to look at working time and time-related underemployment. Sometimes people are entirely going out of the labor market and not looking for work because they perceive that there isn't work available. And these are not going to show up as unemployed. So you need this wider range of indicators to understand these complex impacts. Our strategy over the longer term is to mainstream collection of data using the 19th ICLS, in particular through the labor force survey. And we've been doing a lot of work on guidance development, on tools development, and supporting countries through training and technical assistance to try and achieve this. And this all reflects the extensive experience we've built up by now of working with countries on testing the right ways to apply the standards. Many important measurement lessons have been learned in that process, such as the survey instrument does make a difference. So if you're using a labor force survey versus something like an income and expenditure survey, you can expect it will make a difference to the level of employment and unemployment you measure. This is something we've observed in studies. And careful design is needed to avoid missing out on casual and informal work in particular, and people who work without pay in family businesses. And this is particularly important for women's work. And all of this, there's evidence, reports, etc., laying this out clearly. And that guidance is available at that link. So finally, I do want to mention, again, given the time we're in, 2020, some of the other things we know. Maintaining data collection is clearly very difficult this year. We have been supporting countries in these efforts, and there is a range of guidance developed. I provided a link here because clearly I don't have time to go through it now. The best option you have is to maintain a labor force survey with up-to-date standards and good measurement practices. So for example, the right concepts applied, good data collection methods. These are things we go into in the guidance. And rapid surveys is something I want to mention because they are increasingly occurring. They are very useful short-term solution potentially for some data, but they are not a replacement to a well-designed labor force survey, which will establish a time series for you on key issues. So thank you very much. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you so much, Kieran, for that presentation. I particularly enjoyed and found really helpful this perspective of shifting from thinking about this as a work as an economic productivity question to thinking about it socially. And once you make that shift and you really start collecting this richer data, you open up a lot of insights on gender.
Absolutely. And it can meet both purposes. That's the point. If you do it well, it actually fulfills both, as opposed to just being based on one and therefore being very lacking on the other. So thank you, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope we can get more into that and some of these other questions during the discussion. But before that, I do want to turn it over to Emile to hear directly about the experience from your perspective of implementing these standards in Côte d'Ivoire. Emile, I believe you're muted. Emile, I think you need to unmute.
It looks to me like you're still on mute, Emile.
The new labor statistics were introduced in 2014, just after the 19th ICLS. Since then, we have conducted free labor surveys. The one of 2014 and 2016, and then the last one, 2019. So last year. Now about the challenges encountered, we might say firstly, that the challenges should be placed in the context of Côte d'Ivoire. Indeed, the old standards were themselves little known to the general public in Côte d'Ivoire. They were controlled by only a few players in charge of the production of labor market statistics, like me. Moreover, because very few publications were made prior to the new labor statistics standards, concept of labor statistics were very little under control. In fact, over the last 30 years, Côte d'Ivoire conducted the most regular employment surveys in the decade of 2010-2020, and the most were based on the new standards. I mean, there's only one survey, that of 2012, that was conducted under the old standards. About the challenges, we can notice, for example, that some activities previously considered as employment are no longer considered so since the adoption of the new standards. In doing so, the person who carried out activities over a reference period should respond to the search model and be classified as unemployed if the other criteria were met. Unfortunately, this has not always worked well. I mean, there's some person who may be classified as unemployed, but that was not the case. Moreover, the new forms of work defined have not been easy to capture through the questionnaire. In particular, the form of work named or called the other forms of productive work. In doing so, by seeking improvement of the questionnaire over the years, differences are observed on questionnaires that do not always facilitate the comparison between two surveys. But fortunately, participation in more ILO organized workforce, and especially pilot questionnaire on the new standards, an initiative in which Côte d'Ivoire participated, helped to improve the questionnaires on the new standard. Can we continue? It has been more difficult to pass on certain concepts from the new standards to other labor market players. These include new forms of work, the notion of underutilization of labor, potential labor. With regard to the notion of underutilization of labor, it has so far seemed more difficult for actors to understand that than that of unemployment. The reason is that people have generally heard about unemployment, but never about underutilization of workforce. People always think that the concept of unemployment is simpler because it means simply not having a job. In fact, the reasons for labor statisticians to develop the new standard were not well understood. Another obstacle, a challenge, is that can be identified is labor statistics specialists have not been allowed to communicate freely on these issues, which has not facilitated a good understanding of concepts by population. In short, it is the communication and miscommunication of labor statistics that make it difficult for people to access them. Thank you. It is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Emil. I really appreciate you sharing your experience. And I think, there's only so much that you can learn until you actually start trying things in practice. And so it's really helpful to hear from, I think in particular, your comment about it's, once it's collected, that's not really the end of it. There's a whole challenge around communicating these new concepts that's really critical to think about as well. So actually, I want to open up the discussion with a few questions from the audience, and please do continue to share your questions in the chat as well. I see that there was already one, this question was already answered, but Miriam, I'll ask you to answer it again so that all the attendees can hear. So there was a question about, for the Tanzania Labor Force Survey, why the outcome of analysis was only done in selected areas.
Thank you, Nara. The level of the selection of the sample, it depends on the availability of the resources. So you can opt to have the analysis at the national level if you don't have enough resources, and you can opt to have the analysis in the level of national, rural, and urban if you have enough resources to conduct the survey according to the availability of resources. And they also you can opt to have the regional representation if you have enough funding to carry out the survey and they cover all regions. So this survey is covering all regions, but the level of analysis is in 3 areas. It's urban and rural, but Dar es Salaam has been considered as a separate because Dar es Salaam is urban areas. So the level of analysis is urban and rural. So when you mix the Dar es Salaam and the other urban, you cannot get the good result because Dar es Salaam is considered as urban areas. So that's why we have separated the Dar es Salaam, other urban and the rural areas.
Thank you, Miriam. I think that's an important reminder of how much context really matters and how from country to country you really have to make some specific decisions that are really relevant just to the context that you're within. And likewise, Karen, for you, I see you answered this question as well, but if you wouldn't mind answering for the full group, there's a question about the recommended frequency to perform labor force surveys, in particular to collect gender disaggregated data.
So, I mean, the very short answer, as I've put in the chat, is the more frequent, the more value you will get, okay? But of course, we recognize you have to reflect on what the resources are available in the country. So in the ideal world, you would have collection taking place more than once a year, right? Ideally quarterly. Even now we see countries moving to monthly where it's possible, monthly collection and reporting of data. And you get a lot, you do get a lot of added value from that, because what you have is very frequent data points where you're able to observe quite quickly and in a timely way what's happening to the labor market and by extension the economy, okay, because these statistics serve multiple purposes. So in that way, it can be a way to very quickly prepare policy responses, especially in a time like 2020 where there have been huge changes in labor markets, in the economy of many countries. But of course, that's something that comes if you have a lot of resources. So really our message would be as frequently as your resources will allow. So if you can do it annually, it's still incredibly highly valuable, right? Because you have at least fairly regular points to observe how things are changing. If it's every 2 years, it's still valuable. And there are additional practical benefits of having a fairly regular process, because you have staff who are continuously engaged in the process of collecting and using this data. So you get this benefit of building up your expertise at the same time as having more data. Now, if you have a frequency like 5 years, which isn't uncommon, it's still highly valuable, but of course it enables a different type of analysis. So you're seeing how is the structure of the labor market changing, right? But you don't, of course, know at what point between those two data points, which are 5 years apart, did these changes happen, okay? But it's still very highly valuable. I mean, if this is what you have, you will get enormous value from it. But we recommend as much as possible to go for more frequent. And if I might just say, historically, what you have seen for many countries is that it has built up in frequency over time. So many countries, including now countries who have very advanced systems, started with 5 years, then 2 years, then 1 year, and then quarterly, and maybe even eventually monthly. Why? Because when you get the data, it builds up the demand. Okay, so the users see the value and are willing to support the case for the resources to do it more frequently, and so on and so on. So that's the hope we would have, is say, look, if you're in a position where you can only do it once, do it that once, get the best value you can out of that data, and hopefully that starts making the case for doing it more frequently in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It's a really, I think, really helpful to take the long view on this, and to think about not just the value we get from the data in the moment, but how we're building up a broader system and a broader base to be working on going forward. Another question from our audience, and this is to everyone in the panel, is thinking about rebuilding statistical systems post-COVID. How can an initiative like the Gender Data Network help to support that rebuilding?
I might come in if that's okay. I think anyone who advocates for the cause for good data, in this case gender data, but by extension good labor market data, is helping the cause, because we know now that governments are faced with very difficult choices for limited resources. And one of the things we would fear is that we would go backwards in terms of data. We also know we've gone backwards in terms of the real world reality of gender gaps. But in terms of data availability, there is a substantial risk that we will go backwards, because data will be deprioritized. So we need voices making the case. We need the Gender Data Network, whatever it can do to highlight the value of data and what we've lost as a result of losing data, will, to me, make an important contribution. But what we generally see is, I mean, we need to have high-level voices in government, champions, effectively. Data champions are so important. So however we can collectively reach that stage where there are that believe in the cause of data, the better we will be. And then, I mean, building back better to some degree involves technologies and methodologies as well. So we all have a role in trying to explain these things as well as possible. But I think communications and advocacy is probably the single most important thing we can do.
Thank you, Karen. And Miriam, maybe I'll ask you the same question as well. As a member of the Gender Data Network, what role do you see for the network in helping support this rebuilding?
Can you come again?
As a member of the Gender Data Network, how do you see the network supporting you and other statisticians like you to build a stronger statistical system given the post-COVID situation when we're there?
Yeah, I'm learning much from this gender data network, and most of the things that we are discussing we are implementing in our surveys. So this gender data network have helped me very much, and also building my capacity in presentation and preparing of the presentation. So I like this networking.
Thank you, Miriam. And Emil, I'll ask you the same question as well. What role do you see for organizations like the Gender Data Network to support rebuilding statistical systems post-COVID? I think you're on mute, Emil. Sorry, Emil, we still can't hear you. Okay, I'll ask one of our hosts to work on that technical issue, but while we're figuring that out, maybe then I'll kind of go to a broader question again. And Karen, maybe this is for you, given that a lot of the folks on this call are representing country statistical offices. What kind of support can the ILO offer to countries in implementing the labor force surveys and potentially adopting these new standards?
Yes, well, I mean, actually, Emil and Mariam are familiar to some extent with this. It's a range of supports, and I think that's very important to know. I think it works best when we're able to work directly with the statistical office and the other partners in the country to provide technical assistance, building on the various experiences that we've had. So, and in that process, we can provide elements of training to partners, and we can provide direct technical assistance to the various parts of the process required: the sample design, the questionnaire design, the testing, the analysis, the processing, all of these phases. So that is something we can do, and it's generally organized through our network of regional statisticians. So we have regional statisticians in various places. Mariam, for example, will know that in Tanzania, they worked heavily with Jean-Marie Hakizimana, a colleague in the region based in Addis Ababa. And Emil will have worked heavily with a colleague named Yakuba Diallo, who is based in Dakar. So we have colleagues in the region who take requests and basically try to design a program that works best for that country. We also separately provide, obviously, tools and guidance through our website, which I've given some links to during my presentation. We think they're very useful for people to, but we understand it doesn't meet all the needs, but at least they're good reference points to understand issues and see some background as well. And finally, we provide training. So there was very recently a what we call Labour Market Statistics Academy in French, targeting Francophone countries in Africa, to give an overview of the variety of issues involved in generating good labor statistics. So it's a selection of things, and the best thing, I think, is basically to encourage people to make contact, and we can start, and it can start with a discussion of what is it you need. So, right, we don't need to go straight into technical depth. It can be a discussion on trying to understand what the data needs should be for a country, given its context.
Thank you, that's very helpful. I think maybe another kind of thinking about this from the perspective of an international organization, and thinking about, I know there's a lot of discussion around the SDGs. So how do these standards relate to the SDG indicator on unpaid care and domestic work?
That's a very good question. So it depends on how you decide to define unpaid care and domestic work. We would say it does align. Basically, if you take unpaid care and domestic work, childcare, for example, as one part of it, is captured by this concept we call own use provision of services, right? So we would basically say that if you are referencing ICITS and you are referring to the ICLS standards and you apply those in capturing unpaid care work, you will have data you can use for this purpose. Now, the main thing I would say it really requires you to do is to include some different categories, right? In other words, don't just have one category that tries to capture all unpaid care and domestic work, where you say, how much time have you spent doing all these things? It's difficult from a measurement perspective, and it's also very difficult to analyze for those purposes. I mean, it looks ideal because you've just got one number, but of course, the quality of that number is highly questionable, what's actually gone into it when the person has answered. So I suppose the best advice and the most simple advice we give is, when capturing this data, have breakdowns so you can bring it together for different purposes. And in that way, as long as you've covered the relevant activities like childcare, like dependent adult care, you will be able to fulfill this need. This is something, particularly unpaid care work, that we have a project ongoing on about how to achieve the best measurement through light methods, because people might be familiar that this type of work is often captured through time use surveys, but time use surveys, independent time use surveys, while variable, are very expensive and quite complex, and a lot of countries find it difficult to implement them. So we're looking for the methods that we can attach to labor force surveys that still give good quality data, and that's something that we will be delivering as we advance.
Great, thank you so much. We're near the end of our time, so what I would like is to ask each speaker to share a couple of sentences on one critical consideration or takeaway or recommendation that you would have to our audience about measuring women's work. And I'll go in the same order that we had the presentations. So Miriam, I'll start with you to share a closing comment with the audience.
Okay, thank you for the organizer of this meeting. For me, on behalf of National Bureau of Statistics, I'd like also to thank you, the ILO, for good support in implementation of the labor force surveys. They are giving us training in the data analysis, also in the development of the survey instruments. So I'd like to thank you them, and they have to continue to support us. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. And Karen, I'll turn.
Okay, well, and thank you, Miriam. We're very happy to provide support. Yeah, so one message is there is support available. Okay, so don't think that you have to walk this path entirely on your own. The best reference points generally are the practices of other countries, which we try to bring together into guidance. So please do make contact. And the other thing is actually something Emil touched on. Communications are absolutely critical, and they're critical throughout the process. They're critical before you ever start, because you need to build the support. So really, if you're starting from nearly zero now, for example, I would say the first most important thing to do is communicate to key stakeholders about the standards and get them to understand, so that they can support the case for implementing them at some frequency, ideally frequently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And Emil, if your microphone is working and you can unmute, and if you'd like to share a final comment, please do. I'm sorry. Okay, it looks like it's not working then, but thank you so much for joining us all the same. And I want to say thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your work and your experiences with us today. Thank you to Miriam and our partners at UNECA and Open Data Watch for organizing this webinar series. And of course, thank you to the audience for joining us today and contributing to this discussion. Please do keep an eye out for future webinars in this series, and we will share a recording of this on our YouTube page if you want to share with any colleagues who may have missed this. And holidays to those who celebrate. Thank you so much.